Chapter 15, Part 2. The Post-Reformation of Europe continues. But first, a word from our sponsor, Elizabeth. Hello there, Elizabeth, with your Elizabethan Hairstyles. And being how your history teacher likes drama as well, I thought I'd get a little back information on the wacky hairstyles of the Elizabethan era. All right, for heaven's sakes, those styles were nothing but crazy. During the Elizabethan era, high-fizzed hair placed over pads created a lovely heart shape around the frame of the people's faces. This was the in style and was brought about by Leonardo da Vinci because he said that your hair should frame your face. Fair to red hair was the in color, and everybody wanted it to be curly like the Queen Mother. Women would add natural pieces to their brown hair to help fit in and to soften the color of the brown. These pieces were rumored to be from horsehair or even children's. Okay? Wigs totally became the in thing later on in the last quarter of the 1500s, when first introduced in England in 1572. Let's take a moment and look at some of these wildly crazy updos these ladies worked hours to do. Here's an example of what I was talking about, that heart-shaped framed hairstyle that this is Queen Elizabeth that was popular back then. They would stuff pads underneath the hair and then roll them to make that shape. And it became easier when the first metal hair clips were invented in England in 1545. All right, so thank you, Elizabeth, for that informative commercial. Now, back to our actual lesson, because that's what we're here for. Okay, so the religion and the government worked as one deal. So King Henry VII was a Catholic king. Then his son, Henry VIII, was a Catholic king until he became Protestant, just so he could divorce his wife because she hadn't given him any boy children. So third wife down, Henry's wife has a son, which takes his place after Henry dies, and that would be Edward VI. He is not a healthy child, so the Protestant regents reign in his stead until he's of old enough age to reign on his own. But of course, Edward dies, and in steps, with a lot of problems, Mary the First, which is Henry VIII's first child. Okay, she wanted Catholicism to come back, and so she reigned 5 years with a heavy hand, and hence the name Bloody Mary. All right, she died. Imagine that. Next comes in Elizabeth the First, and she is Henry VIII's second child. Okay, and surprise, 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 more religious problems in the country, but she's got a solution. She comes up with the idea of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, which was another denomination or offspring or offshoot of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, here the Archbishop of Canterbury would be the senior cleric or the senior priest or pastor, but the Queen or whoever was the ruling monarch was going to be the supreme governor. Sounds like a great idea, right? Via media, Latin for the middle ground, was the idea that there should be moderation in all thoughts and actions. That doesn't sound so bad. Well, let's look at Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and see how he took this thought and put it into action with the new church that was being developed. Let's take a look. This ray of sunshine is Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the thought was that as they shaped this new church, it would be, and I quote, a religious solution in which secular authority would hold the ring in the religious dispute and ensure public stability. Sounds great that the Queen should reign and the priest underneath her. The Church of England was to be the middle ground between the Lutheranism and Calvinism, both results of the Reformation. Now, while most people went along with yet another change in religion of the country,
there were some groups that did not, like the Catholics, obviously. Then there were the Puritans and the Separatists who wanted no part. And you can kind of understand why now. They had the Bible in their hands, okay? And so the Puritans wanted to purify the church from too much Romanism, and the Separatists just wanted to leave so that they could worship God the way they deemed was correct.
All right, so another denomination occurred during the Reformation in the British Isles. This time, however, it was in Scotland.
We now interrupt this broadcast with a word from our sponsors. Click.
Hello again, it's me, Elizabeth, with the second part of our tutorial commercial break. This time it's the Elizabethan Makeup. Not only was the fair to red hair very popular back then, but also having pale skin was a sign of nobility, wealth, and delicacy. Everybody wanted such white, pale skin, rosy cheeks, and the red lips. Most popular, and whatever the queen did back then was what everybody else wanted to do. And the queen wore something called Venetian ceruse, or the spirits of Saturn. And guess what it was made of? Are you ready? White lead and vinegar. Yes. Let's take just a bit of a second to look at what white lead may look like. And then I'll explain a little bit to you about the not good side of white lead. Let's look.
Here's Elizabeth at her coronation. Note the white skin, red cheeks, and red lips. Here's a picture of the white lead in its mineral form, okay? To make the makeup, they would mix it with water and vinegar, okay? And then spread it over their face. It was found out 31 years after Elizabeth's death that it was poisonous. It would cause graying and wrinkling of the skin. It would cause hair loss and rotting of the teeth and eventually death. This is what the mineral looked like when it was pounded out.
Oh my word, you've got to be asking yourself, why did they use this concoction? Well, for the most part, it's because they didn't know any better. And it also was what they used to cover up if they survived smallpox, which was a disease that was rampant back then. Okay, if you survived smallpox, then you would have scarred or pocketed skin, and it looked really, really bad. Queen Elizabeth got smallpox when she was 29, and thankfully she survived it, but her skin was not beautiful, smooth anymore, and so she started using the Venetian cream. Okay, the other thing that's about this is that each year she had to, because it was wrinkling her skin and eating away at it, she would have to put more and more, cake more and more of that white paste cream on herself. And you know, girls, when you wear makeup, you wear it for a day and you clean it off. At least I hope you do. Well, these people left that stuff on for a week. And then they cleaned it off. And guess what they used to clean it with? Not soap and water. They used as their cleaner either rose water and lemon juice, which would be great, except that wasn't used very often. But instead they used alum, which is a poison, eggshells, mercury, which is a poison, and honey. One redeeming factor in there. Okay? They thought that it would leave their skin soft and smooth, where in reality, it was eating away at their skin as well. So, with all this white makeup, not only did Elizabeth and the other ladies of that time do this, but Elizabeth also made her own lipstick. Wait until you see what she used to make that with before we return to our lesson. So let's take a look. Here we go.
Here we have the main ingredient, which was an insect from Mexico that they dried and crushed to make this vibrant red dye that you'll see in a second, okay? They would take this dye and mix it with fig milk, egg whites, and gum of Arabic. They believed that this lipstick had magical healing powers. Now, sometimes they would use cinnabar, this toxic mineral here, which contained mercury. They grind it up to make a red pigment as well called vermilion and mix that into the lipstick. Oh my lands. Well, with all this lovely bit of information, back to our Scottish Reformation.
All right, so Scotland, and enter in John Knox, a two-handed sword-swinging notary priest. He was first influenced by the early church reformer George Wishart, okay, and became a sort of bodyguard for his newfound friend, until, of course, his newfound friend was executed. All right, John Knox is a video that we're going to watch in just a second, but I have a pop quiz for you guys. So go get your piece of paper, and here are the questions you're going to look for during this video. You got your paper yet? Are you ready? All right, number 1, okay? At the beginning of the Reformation in Scotland, Cardinal Beaton was captured in the castle with some of his friends. What did those friends try to do in order to escape? Okay, so Cardinal Beaton was captured in the castle at the beginning with his friends, and his friends tried to do what in order to escape? Number 2, while the first Protestant service was going on in that same such castle, what happened to Cardinal Beaton? I feel a little bad for him, okay? During the very first Protestant service held in that church castle, what happened to the cardinal? And number 3, in 1559, when John Knox returned to Scotland for good, what did he become? Last question. In 1559, when John Knox returned to Scotland for good, what did he become? What was his new title? Okay, so go ahead and watch the video, and then we'll talk some more. All right, so John Knox also helped to write the Book of Common Prayer and began the Church of Scotland, also known as the Presbyterian Church, or the very first denomination of that. The church was approved finally years later in 1572 by young King James VI. Now, backtrack a little bit. So when John Knox came on the scene, that was when Mary, Queen of Scots, came back from France because her husband had died, and so now she's going to be Queen of Scotland. But when she came back, she had a world full of troubles. So let's take a look at the next video, which is the Mary, Queen of Scots, and then you can come back to me. Alrighty, so that video was a very sad state of affair for Mary, Queen of Scots. It ended with talking about the Spanish Armada, and we've already talked about that situation, remember? The fire ships and mass confusion and a great storm that blew them north around the British Isles, and then sinking of ships and dying of the sailors, and only a few ships getting back to Spain. It was not good, but it looked good for Queen Elizabeth. She came out being victorious with God's help, of course. That was when the golden age of the Elizabethan era began, okay? And I'll turn my page so I know what I'm saying next to this cute kitty who looks incredibly uncomfortable, but I'm glad I'm not a cat. Anyway. Okay, so during the golden age of England, that's when the theater and the poets and the songwriters really thrived. Let's take a second and switch gears, and we're going to go across the Great Pond to France. Alrighty, so we went across the pond into the kitchen, but that's okay, into France. Since the king and the church worked together, they ruled together, the king really had power over the church, at least in France. The Reformation was stated to not be a political revolt, but only a break from the church in France. Well, if you think about that, that would still be seen as a threat to the king's power and authority. Francis I and Henry II both did not take lightly this new group called the Huguenots, the new Calvinistic Protestant followers of Calvin, and their stage left exit of the Church of Rome that was in France. They first met in Paris in 1558 as an assembly of representatives to write up their confession of faith, what they believed, and an address to the king to let him know where they stood and why they were leaving the church. They were trying to do everything in the right order. Here is where Francis II and his wife, Mary Queen of Scots, fit in. Okay, we are kind of ping-ponging back and forth in time, but this is where they fit in France. When she went over there and she got married to him when I believe she was 18, this is during this time the Huguenots are around. Okay. Okay, so, well, we know what happened with King Francis. He died a year after he had married Mary, and then she had to go back to Scotland. Francis II had two other brothers that would rule after him. Their mother, Catherine, tried to control the throne for her sons because the two younger ones were still little. But really, the two leading powers of religion battled to control her, and those were the Protestants and the Catholics. So what happened? There was 9 civil wars that ruined France. And the worst of these wars was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Now, there's a movie that I want you to watch, but I have 3 questions for your dun-dun-dun pop quiz. Your paper should still be out from before. Number 1, what city did the massacre begin in at night? And where did the massacre begin in the middle of the night? What town? Okay. Number 2. Okay, so the admiral was actually assassinated. Where? The queen set orders for the admiral's assassination. Where was he killed at? Not what city, but where, okay? And that's what started the whole massacre thing. And the last question is, how many governors refused to obey the king's order to massacre the Protestants in their area? How many governors stood up and said, we respect the king, but we're respectfully not obeying you? How many? Okay, those are your 3 questions for this pop quiz that's required for this history lesson. Watch the video and come back to me. Oh my word, people, how far will one group go with their hatred for another? It was pretty excessive, the reaction of the people in Rome, especially the Pope. That's pretty sad. Nevertheless, so 17 years after the massacre, the head cheeses of France had died, either by assassination or by just dying. Okay. Enter in Henry of Navarre. And I thought to myself, we're talking about Spain and France and England and Scotland. Where in the wide world of sports is Navarre? So I looked. Here in my trusty map of maps. Here's France and England and Scotland. And here's Spain. So Navarre sits on the northernmost part of Spain, but it's on the west side of the slopes of the Pyrenees mountain, which separates France from Spain. Okay, so this is where it is. It's a part of France, but it was separate and kept its own king. So there's a king of France, and then there's the king of Navarre, which is Henry. Okay. Let me see where that is in my notes since I'm paraphrasing. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so Navarre stayed separate kingdom until 1589, when Henry became the king, was not only the king of Navarre, but became the king of France due to natural succession. I didn't quite understand that, but that's when it got annexed in, Navarre did, into France, okay? Okay, so, can you believe this king, though? All right, he was Protestant. And then in order to live through the massacre, he said, I'll change my religion, which I can't fault him too much. It must have been something scary. But then when he became king, he could have stayed Protestant. But he became Catholic because the French people are like, sacre bleu! We cannot have a king who is not Catholic. All right, so that was really awful. I apologize. But so he became Catholic to make them happy. But then the Protestant people are like, what in the world? You are on our side. What is with that? So in order to make them happy and to kind of settle down the fires, all right, he came up with the Edict of Nantes. I believe that's how you say it, all right? And what this said was that the Huguenots, or the Protestants, would have certain areas where they could live and practice and teach their form of denomination, religion, okay? They were also given 100 cities that could be used for fortification for their armies and their garrisons and to protect themselves. However, this was great for 12 years. And at the end of the 12 years, Henry IV was killed, surprise, surprise, by Francisco Raveleras, okay, in Paris. And what happened is this guy was a Catholic fanatic, it said, and so the king's in his carriage, picture it, okay, he's in this carriage, and he's got all his horsemen and stuff, and he's stuck in traffic. There's something going on at the palace, and he's trying to get there, and he's late, and so he's stuck in traffic, and here comes Francisco, and he stabs the king to death in front of everybody.
Sweet.
Yeah, so it wasn't sweet. It wasn't great at all, okay? It was horrible. And so then is left the queen and Henry's 9-year-old son, the Prince Louis VIII, okay? So now the little boy becomes king, and the queen tries to be in charge of the country, and the head cardinal was like, he backhandedly comes in and he takes over the regent's power, okay? He wanted the king, he said, to have more power than what he had before, and so the cardinal would take care of that for them. But really, he had his own selfish desires, and one of them came about in the Peace of Alice, A-L-A-I-S, okay? And what that did was the Huguenots were allowed to still practice their religion and have civil and religious freedoms. However, they lost their protection, their fortified cities and their army, no more garrison, no more ways to protect themselves.
And now, one more final word from our sponsors. And yes, sorry to interrupt this program.
And now another interesting fashion in the Elizabethan era was called a ruff. It was worn by men, women, and children, and what started as a small fabric ruffle with a drawstring at the neck of a shirt and a separate piece of fabric clothing was used to keep the person's gown and shirts from getting dirty. It soon changed into a stiff garment that forced upright posture. These useless pieces of garment led them to become a symbol of wealth and status. I have no idea how that could be, but later they were made of lace, an expensive new fabric developed in the early 1500s. The ruff could be colored by vegetable dyes to yellow, pink, or mauve tint, but pale blue had become forbidden by Queen Elizabeth because, well, you know, it's a color on the flag of Scotland. Ruffs could be a foot or more wide in their extremities, and they kept their shape in Christmas with folds of starch and heated irons. Some had wire frames to hold them at a weird angle, which was called a cartwheel ruff. Ruffs fell out of fashion in Europe in the 1700s. However, ruffs do remain part of formal attire for bishops and ministers, for choir patrons, judges, or musicians during special situations, usually in Denmark.
Okay, so the next section that you had to read this week was about Germany and the 30-Year War. Well, we've already talked about that before, so I'm going to saunter on past that section and just touch a bit on Bohemia, okay? They had already experienced the Reformation 100 years prior to all this nonsense with John Huss and the version of the Bible for them. Well, they defended the Reformation and their Protestantism until the year 1619, when at that point the Catholic king, with the help of Spain, began to crush and push back the Protestant resistance, smashing to smithereens the political and religious liberty in Bohemia. The fight for that control of the religious freedom spread everywhere, as you read, from Bohemia to Sweden, Spain, Denmark, England, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France. Land sakes. The effect of this long battle was a few things. One, the Holy Roman Empire lost their power for good. Germany, however, was horribly devastated, with 8 million people dead from the consequences of that war, whether it was starvation or it was sickness or just whatever. Okay, it was really bad. Germany was broken into many little states. For the next 200 years, they were not united as a country. Europe became a land of diversity. All right, everyone, this should end chapter 15 finally, and the post-Reformation aftermath stuff. Next week is chapter 16. Oh, and it says post-Reformation. Except this time it's going to be about science and inventions and that kind of culture-y stuff. So maybe it should be interesting. I'll see you guys next week. Toodaloo!